Did you see something?
In a world filled with noise, conflict, and uncertainty, the quest for peace can feel like searching for a needle in a haystack. Chaos seems to surround us, be it the stormy seas of our emotions, the tumult of unexpected life changes, or the weight of external pressures that threaten to overwhelm us. Yet throughout the Bible, we find powerful stories of individuals who faced tremendous challenges but discovered peace in the most chaotic moments. These accounts remind us that even in the midst of turmoil, we can find solace and strength in trusting God's presence and promises. Join us as we explore these remarkable occasions, learning how faith can anchor us when the storms of life rage around us. 1. In the story of Jesus calming the storm, peace can be obtained through calling up on the Lord. Mark 4:39, he got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Peace, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. Jesus and his disciples were caught in a violent storm while sailing across the sea. The disciples were terrified, thinking they would drown. But Jesus, calmly sleeping, awoke and rebuked the storm with the words, "Peace, be still," and the storm instantly stopped. In our daily lives, storms represent times of crisis, financial problems, relationship struggles, or health challenges. Like the disciples, we may feel overwhelmed and fearful, but just as Jesus calmed the storm, he can bring peace to our hearts. Imagine being in a situation where you're facing financial hardship. Bills are piling up, and you're stressed. Instead of letting the chaos control you, trust that God has the power to bring calmness into your life. Call on him as the disciples did, and have faith that he will quiet your storm. In the story of the Red Sea, peace comes through remaining still and waiting upon the Lord. Exodus 14:14, the Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. When the Israelites fled from Egypt, they found themselves trapped between Pharaoh's army and the Red Sea. The people panicked, but Moses assured them that God would fight for them. God parted the Red Sea, allowing them to escape, and the waters swallowed up the Egyptian army. In life, we sometimes face situations where we feel trapped with no escape. Perhaps a job loss, a serious illness, or family conflict. Just like the Israelites, we can feel hopeless and scared. Imagine feeling like there's no way out of a toxic situation, maybe at work or in a relationship. Moses reminds us to be still and trust that God is working even when we don't see the solution. Sometimes, peace comes not from fighting back, but from waiting and trusting God to open a way when the time is right. 3. In the story of Daniel in the lion's den, peace comes when we trust God to defend us. Daniel 6:22. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. Daniel was thrown into a den of lions because he continued to pray to God despite a royal decree forbidding it. Instead of panicking, Daniel trusted God, and an angel shut the lions' mouths, keeping him safe. Life often feels like we're surrounded by lions, people or situations that threaten our peace. Whether it's workplace politics, unjust accusations, or dangerous circumstances, God can protect us. Imagine being wrongly accused of something serious, where it seems like everyone is against you. Instead of being overwhelmed by fear or anger, you could take comfort in Daniel's story. Peace comes when we trust God to defend us, even when everything around us feels hostile. 4. In the story of Paul and Silas in prison, peace comes through prayer and worship. Acts 16:25. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. Paul and Silas were unjustly beaten and imprisoned for preaching the gospel. Instead of despairing, they prayed and sang hymns, and miraculously, an earthquake shook the prison, opening the doors and breaking their chains. Sometimes life can feel like a prison, whether it's a dead-end job, a toxic relationship, or depression. When chaos surrounds us, we can still choose to find peace by praising God, as Paul and Silas did. Imagine being stuck in a situation that feels inescapable, maybe a work environment where you feel mistreated. Instead of sinking into hopelessness, you can choose to focus on God through prayer and worship. Miracles often happen when we shift our focus away from the problem and toward God. 5. In the story of Gideon's victory over the Midianites, peace comes when we rely on God's strength, not our own. Judges 7:7. The Lord said to Gideon, "With the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands." Gideon faced a massive enemy army with just 300 soldiers, yet God assured him of victory. Despite the odds, Gideon trusted God and won the battle. Life often presents us with overwhelming odds, whether it's a difficult exam, an intimidating job interview, or a health battle. Imagine facing a challenge that seems impossible to overcome, like paying off huge debt with very little income. Gideon's story shows that victory doesn't depend on our resources, but on our trust in God. Peace comes when we rely on God's strength, not our own. 6. In the story of Elijah and the still small voice, peace comes when we are still in our minds and listen to God's gentle. 1 Kings 19:12. And after the earthquake a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire, and after the fire a still small voice. Elijah fled to the wilderness, fearing for his life after a great victory over the prophets of Baal. He was tired, discouraged, and in chaos. But God did not come to him in a loud, dramatic way. Instead, he spoke in a quiet, gentle whisper. When life feels chaotic, we often expect God to fix everything dramatically. But peace often comes in the quiet moments when we still our minds and listen to God's gentle guidance. Imagine being overwhelmed with constant noise and demands at work, home, or social media. Take time to withdraw into silence and listen for God's quiet reassurance, finding peace in his still small voice. 7. In the story of Joseph's brothers in Egypt, peace comes through forgiveness. Genesis 50:19-20. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Joseph's brothers had sold him into slavery years earlier, intending to get rid of him. But Joseph, now a powerful ruler in Egypt, forgave them and recognized that God had used their betrayal for a greater purpose. Sometimes people hurt us deeply, and it feels like chaos in our hearts. Imagine being betrayed by a close friend or family member. Joseph's story teaches us that peace comes through forgiveness and trusting that God can use even the worst situations for good. Instead of holding on to anger or pain, release it to God and find peace in his bigger plan. 8. In the story of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, peace comes from surrendering to God's will. Luke 22:42. Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will but yours be done. On the night before his crucifixion, Jesus prayed in deep anguish, knowing the suffering that day him. Despite his distress, he submitted to God's will. In our moments of deepest fear and anxiety, like facing a major life decision or personal crisis, peace comes from surrendering to God's will. Imagine facing a tough decision about your future, maybe between two career paths or a major move. Like Jesus, we may feel the weight of the choice, but peace is found in trusting that God's will is always for our good. 9. In the story of the woman with the issue of blood, peace comes from reaching out to Jesus in faith. Luke 8:44. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. A woman suffering from a chronic illness for 12 years reached out in faith to touch Jesus' garment, believing that it would heal her. And it did. In times of personal health struggles or emotional pain, we often feel hopeless, just as this woman did. Imagine battling an illness or long-term emotional trauma where all solutions seem to fail. Like the woman, reaching out to Jesus in faith brings peace and healing even when nothing else seems to work. 10. In the story of Noah and the ark, peace comes from knowing that God remembers us and will send relief at the right time. Genesis 8:1. But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark, and he sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded. After 40 days of rain, Noah and his family were in the ark with the animals, surrounded by water, with no clear end in sight. Yet God remembered them and began to dry the floodwaters. Sometimes we feel like we're drowning in problems with no relief in sight. Imagine going through months of unemployment or a long-term struggle, unsure when things will improve. Peace comes from knowing that God remembers us and will send relief at the right time. We must trust in His timing. 11. In the story of Joshua and the walls of Jericho, peace comes from trusting that God's ways will bring victory in His time. Joshua 6:20. When the trumpet sounded, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed, so everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. The Israelites faced an impenetrable city, Jericho, but God gave them strange instructions. March around the walls and shout. When they obeyed, the walls collapsed, and they won the city. Sometimes in life, our problems seem as massive and unmovable as the walls of Jericho: debt, broken relationships, addiction. Imagine trying to get out of a cycle of debt that feels impossible to overcome. Like Joshua, we must have faith and follow God's unique instructions, even when they don't make sense. Peace comes from trusting that God's ways will bring victory in His time. 12. In the story of Jesus walking on water, peace comes when we fix our eyes on Jesus. Matthew 14:27. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." The disciples were terrified as they saw Jesus walking toward them on the stormy sea, but He told them to take courage and not be afraid. Peter briefly walked on water too, until fear made him sink. We often face life's storms with fear, but peace comes when we fix our eyes on Jesus. Imagine being in a stressful situation at work or school where things are out of your control. Instead of focusing on the chaos, focus on Jesus. The more we trust Him, the more peace we'll find, even in the midst of the storm. But like Peter, we begin to sink when fear takes over, so keep your eyes on God. 13. In the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, peace comes from trusting that God is with you in the fire. Daniel 3:18. But even if He does not, we want you to know, Your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods. These 3 men were thrown into a fiery furnace for refusing to worship an idol. But they told the king they trusted God to save them, even if He didn't. God protected them, and they walked out unharmed. In life, we sometimes face the heat of peer pressure or persecution, and the temptation to compromise our faith. Imagine being pressured by others to compromise your morals or values at work or in friendships. Peace comes from trusting that God is with you in the fire, even if the outcome seems uncertain. Like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we must stand firm, knowing that God is our ultimate protector. 14. In the story of Elisha's servant and the army of angels, peace comes from knowing that we are never alone in our battles. 2 Kings 6:16. Don't be afraid, the prophet answered. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them. Elisha's servant panicked when he saw an enemy army surrounding them. But Elisha prayed for God to open his eyes, and the servant saw the hills filled with heavenly chariots and horses. When we face overwhelming situations, we often feel outnumbered and alone. Imagine facing a huge problem at work or home, feeling like it's just you against the world. Elisha's servant learned that God's army was on their side. We may not always see it, but God surrounds us with His protection and help. Peace comes from knowing that we are never alone in our battles. 18. In the story of Esther saves her people, peace comes through fasting and prayer. Esther 4:16. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. Esther was in a dangerous position. She needed to approach the king without being summoned, which could lead to her death, in order to save her people. Instead of panicking, she called for fasting and prayer, seeking God's guidance. In moments of high pressure or when we have tough decisions to make, peace comes from seeking God through prayer and fasting. Imagine facing a major decision that could affect your life's path, like choosing between 2 career opportunities or making a big family decision. Like Esther, taking time to pray and seek God's wisdom leads to peace, even in the face of uncertainty. 19. In the story of Jonah in the belly of the fish, peace comes when we repent. Jonah 2:2, In my distress I called to the Lord, and He answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead I called for help, and you listened to my cry. Jonah disobeyed God's command to go to Nineveh, and as a result, he found himself swallowed by a giant fish. In the belly of the fish, Jonah prayed and repented, and God rescued him. Sometimes we find ourselves in tough situations because of our own choices, like poor decisions in relationships or finances. Imagine being in the depths of financial ruin or emotional pain because of past mistakes. Like Jonah, peace comes when we repent and call out to God, knowing He will hear and deliver us, even from the deepest pits of chaos. 20. In the readings about the Good Shepherd, peace of Psalm 23 comes from knowing that, like a shepherd, God will guide us. Psalm 23, 1-3. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. In Psalm 23, David describes God as a shepherd who leads, guides, and provides. Even though we walk through difficult times, we are assured of His protection and peace. Life can feel like walking through dark valleys, grief, loss, or difficult changes. Imagine losing a loved one or going through a significant life change. The peace of Psalm 23 comes from knowing that, like a shepherd, God will guide us to rest and refreshment, providing for our needs even in the hardest times. As we reflect on these biblical stories, let us remember that peace is not merely the absence of chaos, but a deep-seated assurance that God is with us, guiding us through life's storms. No matter how overwhelming our circumstances may seem, we can draw strength from the examples of those who have walked before us, who faced their fears and chose to trust in God's unfailing love. May we too find our peace in the midst of chaos, leaning on His promises and resting in His presence, knowing that with God all things are possible.